How you doing, Buddha?
Hey, I'm well, thank you. Thank you so much. You've gotten us started already, which is fantastic. We'd like to stay on time as much as possible, so it's a pleasure seeing you, Kin. Well, I'm not going to take too much time because I can see people are already joining in. I think they are just moving rooms at this point of time. I can see the numbers going up in attendance. And while we do that, perhaps just to give you a quick context, well, Kane over here is not a person who needs any introduction. He is the original API evangelist with a whole lot of experience in the world of API governance, both from an implementer standpoint, from a decision maker standpoint. And with his experience, we are hoping to lean into what is said to be a journey of about 25 years into the world of HTTP APIs. And well, even after so long, his API governance really in place for you. So we'll explore all of that with Kane. It's going to be a fun session to kick us off once again. Hopefully, you'll participate, you'll engage, you'll ask us questions as we go along. Ken will kick us off with the topic itself. Once we are done, I'll come back on for any questions. Feel free to ask questions at any point of time. We'll pick it up at the end. But without further ado, over to you, Ken.
All right. Thank you, Buddha. You're the best. Appreciate it. Um, Thanks for having me. Tyke's great. This is my first time at Leap though, so I'm very excited to be here. I'm going to talk to you about 25 years of HTTP APIs and ask some questions about governance along the way here. So before I dive in, let's let me tell a little bit about myself, why I'm here, and what I'm condensing into this talk. So my name is Kin Lane. I study the technology, business policies, and people of APIs. Been doing this full time since 2010. I'm originally a database guy, but in 2010, I started API Evangelist to study all of this. It's been quite a wild ride. Lots of stories to share along the way, but a few highlights. I was a presidential innovation fellow for the Obama administration, but I think many of you probably started tuning into what I was doing when I joined Postman as the chief evangelist and director of the Open Technologies program there. I also had a podcast called Breaking Changes. And then for the last year, I've been standing up a governance program at Bloomberg. So what I'm gonna walk through today is a distillation of everything that I learned doing API Evangelist over the last 15 years, but really a condensed version of that when I started talking to enterprise customers at Postman. My notebook says there was 126 enterprise conversations that I had while working there for 4 years. And then the Breaking Changes podcast, there was 165 episodes of Breaking Changes. Not all of them saw the light of day, but governance and product development were the top two talking points for those conversations. And then 2023 and 24, I really want to understand how that applied out in the field. And I got a good taste of that standing it up at Bloomberg. And then now this is what I'm doing full time for other customers. Let's level set a little bit. Let's kind of geolocate ourselves in time. So in February of 2000, Salesforce launched their API along with their enterprise class Internet as a Service product. And so they were XML APIs, but they were over HTTP. And there were other HTTP APIs prior to this, but this is kind of the inception point that a lot of people work from. And here we are, February 2025, a quarter century later. I feel old. I don't know about y'all. This is from 2018. Akamai says that 83% of their web traffic is APIs. Now, Cloudflare echoes this with about a 60 to 65%, but however you look at it, about 50 to 75% of the traffic is APIs. And I'm sure this has just gotten a little crazier in the last couple of years. So after a quarter century, do you have API governance in place? Now, it's interesting to hear, looking back to how we described governance even just 5 years ago. I would say early days, API governance was wrapped as API management in the early days. So it's unfair for me to be poking at, did you have API governance in the early days? But as we built out our APIs, there's always been, starting in 2006 with the launch of Mastery, there's always been a desire to manage and get a handle on our APIs and standardize them. So all of these concepts that you're learning, you're going to hear today, are part of that evolution. So let's dive in. What is API governance? Now, I start API governance with schema. So this might be a little bit different than what you're hearing from other folks and other vendors and analysts when it comes to what API governance is. But after getting hands-on within the enterprise, I'm pretty confident that API governance foundationally has to begin with schema. Schema is ubiquitous across all of our enterprise organizations, primarily in the form of JSON schema right now. But you have protocol buffers and you have other types of schemas, database schemas, you have schemas powering forms. But JSON schema is ubiquitous across your enterprise, whether you realize it or not, whether you have a handle on it or not. Now, JSON schema is your open API spec, meaning if you're using Swagger and open API, okay, asterisk, Swagger is a different beast. But if you're using open API, it's JSON schema. It's validated, it's defined. You're using JSON schema, not just for your request and your response payloads, but you're using it to validate your APIs all along the way in your design tools, in your pipelines, and in your gateway. These schemas oftentimes lack a lot of the metadata, the human nutrients that people are going to need to make sense of these things. And then they have all the properties of your digital objects. All the little details you need for that digital transformation is present in these JSON schema objects. Now, where it really comes down to it is how well can you validate all of those schemas in motion across your enterprise as they're being designed, developed, as they're being requested and part of responses. Can you actually validate and say, yes, this is what it is? So this is what schema is all about. And it's a fundamental building block of API operations. It's the foundation of your governance. And you need to have a certain amount of schema, JSON schema literacy amongst your teams, as well as tooling to be able to realize this. Otherwise, things are going to be a mess. So a significant portion of that chaos that we heard people talking about, it's JSON schema related. It just surfaces itself in many different ways. But let's move a little closer to what you probably think API governance is about and what you've been hearing. So APIs, that's what we're governing here, right? So huge opportunity. HTTP APIs, as I said, 50 to 75, 50 to 80% of your traffic. We've been doing this a quarter century. It is the dominant pattern in your enterprise when it comes to your digital resources and capabilities. Now it's critical, if you're going to be successful with API governance, you understand all the perspectives that are at play here. Whether you are a producer or an API consumer, ideally you're both. But those are important distinctions that a lot of people don't understand and a lot of people don't think about on a daily basis. Now, there's other perspectives involved in this storytelling that you need to be aware of. There are API service providers who are selling tools and services to the space. There's API analysts and people like me who are studying the space and making sense of things. And so it's really helpful to have an awareness and an understanding when you're doing API governance of where these stories are coming from and what their intention is and what is success to them. Now, another thing that gets people in a lot of trouble and causes a lot of problems with API governance is when it comes to the approach taken. Is it design first? Is it code first? But then alongside of that, you're having to struggle and wrestle with access levels, access and control over those APIs, which will define governance and define how APIs are done. Is it purely an internal API? Is it an API that's just powering one of our web or mobile or AI applications? Or is it an actual first-class third-party API that we're producing as a product? API governance in these three different realms means very different things. And so when it comes to access and control and the approach taken, You really got to understand that and think deeply about it when it comes to your API governance. Now, another area where things are fragmented and chaotic and contributing is the different types of APIs out there. I'm focused 100% on just HTTP APIs. Now, I understand that spans GraphQL, as well as the event-driven when you start talking about WebSockets and other long-lived connections. But Kafka, RabbitMQ, other event-driven, and gRPC APIs, MQTT, there's many different APIs out there. I recommend starting with the basics when it comes to governance. Yes, a lot of what we're talking about here applies across all of these types, but stay focused, stay true what you're trying to accomplish, and do it with the digital resources that are the most ubiquitous. Start with HTTP APIs. I know you're being told to do GraphQL and event-driven and gRPC as well, but just focus when it comes to governance on what matters the most, and then you can expand that as needed. Now, when you're doing APIs, you've got to understand OpenAPI. OpenAPI is the specification you're using to describe the entire surface area of your APIs. You can't govern what is not defined as an OpenAPI artifact. That is why the OpenAPI is in use, so that we can come together on the same page and talk about the same things when it comes to status codes, when it comes to responses, when it comes to paths. It gets us on the same page, gives us a common artifact, and that in itself is governance. Now, another big area that I encounter a lot of friction, a lot of problems when it comes to the API chaos is talk of centralization first versus federation. And there's a lot of talking past each other, and we don't know whether we're talking about, are we federating governance? Are we federating the gateway? Are we federating the development of APIs? And so being aware of distribution requires a lot of nuance and a lot of specificity when it comes to what are we talking about when we mean centralized versus federated. Now, platform conversations, governance conversations, center of excellence, this is where these conversations are happening, but they're an important piece of just managing APIs. And then the last piece, I'm always going to end on the human experience. So none of this matters without the human piece. And I'm not just talking API consumer experience. I'm talking API producer experience, talking design first, code first experience. All across all of these areas, you have to look at the human piece. And that's what this is all about, is understanding what actually matters to the teams producing APIs, the teams who are consuming them, as well as other levels of architects and compliance and security and people who maybe are secondarily associated with those APIs. What's their experience? What do they understand and how do they see things? All right. Now we're probably where you are a little more familiar with what's going on with governance than what you're hearing in the space. That when you hear the word governance, this is the core of it. You have rules, primarily specy or spectral, or sometimes some custom rules. And then now we have vacuum rules, which are compatible with spectral rules. And these are just little rules that lint for things in that open API and lint for things that should be common. Things like HTTP status codes, things like path casing and parameter casing. And so rules are how we define these little bits and bytes. But as I talked about just previously with experience, it's not the rule that matters. It's everyone working towards and creating those rules. Now, those rules should be applied to your schema. You shouldn't just be applying spectral rules and vacuum rules to your open API artifacts. There's a portion of that that is JSON schema. So there's also no reason why you shouldn't use those same rules outside of your open API to lend the completeness, the quality, and the overall bar for your schema. And then, yes, you apply those to your open API specs as well. You use that to govern the design of it and how complete and robust and ready your APIs are. Now, one thing you'll hit real fast is operationally. You've got to be governing things at the operational level. So we aren't just governing Does the Open API have an operation ID in the Open API? Are those SDKs that we generate from that Open API that depend on that operation ID, are those published to the portal? So we're not just governing examples in the Open API. We're governing, is there a sandbox in the portal and available for developers to use? So this is that following a piece of governance to its logical conclusion and make sure we're governing everything along the way. And most importantly, we're guiding, because good governance is just guidance. So when it comes to those schemas and open APIs and those technical bits, how are we also guiding or governing our teams when it comes to those downstream impacts? Now, when it comes to these rules, how are we leveraging sensible events, usage of our pipelines, and scheduling of the automation around these rules and the enforcement? I emphasize the sensible. There's a lot of desire to automate. Once we have a rule, we're like, yes, we have the rule. Let's automate it and put it in place. That rule is nothing without that human coordination, human awareness, and human understanding. And so automation should be approached very cautiously. Again, centralized and federated plays an important part, but then also the reviews. You got to be doing reviews in person. You got to make them self-service, and then you got to be doing them in an ongoing way. Do not make your reviews a bottleneck. That'll be the first problem you encounter once you stand up a centralized governance. Make it something that can be done in motion. And then always be perpetually aligning your rule set through discussion, through meetings, and aligning it with the wider organization. This is not something that's done once and it's over with. This requires constant weekly review of your policies, of your rules, of your automation and processes, and then be adjusting and aligning it with the wider enterprise business strategy. Now, the first wall you're going to hit after you start implementing all of that governance, whether it's centralized or federated or any approach, is you're going to have to widen that. You're going to have to bring more visibility to the life cycle. When are these rules applied? Where are they applied at the platform level? Is this a federated, centralized? Is this a shared approach? So bringing more visibility for teams where and when they apply those rules is going to be pretty key. Second biggest problem you're going to hit is, hey, we're governing all the technical details. We're not governing enough of the business details. Like I said, are the examples making it in the sandbox for the consumers? Are the SDKs getting generated? All of those downstream impacts, govern those as well. And then standardizing the properties of our API operations. Are those sandboxes standardized? Is our documentation? Is our SDK delivery and generation? What are the tools, the clients and other things that developers are using? Jupyter notebooks, Postman workspaces. So how are we standardizing those properties of our API operations so they're consistent across teams, not just the APIs? And then again, acknowledge that it's centralized and federated. There is no centralized versus federation. It's both. You got to just have that conversation operationally where things should be and what matters most. And then having a clear, be explicit. Why are we doing APIs? Can anyone answer why their organization's actually doing APIs? I don't think there's one clear answer. Applications, integrations, what are the reasons why we're doing it? What are the business reasons? Because that's how we're going to prioritize when it comes to API governance. Now, change is inevitable. But this is another fundamental area that if you don't have a few things, if you don't have a few things in order before you get started with governance or while you're strengthening and maturing your governance, it's going to get exponentially much harder. So scope, be precise about what level of change things are happening. Is this an API change? Is this an operational change? Or is this, hey, wait, you hear that music? The musical chairs at the leadership level started again. Everyone's chairs are moving. That's a change we've got to govern and be honest about and have a conversation about more. Specification change. Are you using the latest version of OpenAPI? Are you using 3.1? or is there still swagger in place? Are you using the latest draft of JSON schema, or is there 5 or 6 different versions in place? Do you have a central source control for every API? Do you have a source of truth? Because if you don't, everything I just talked about becomes exponentially more difficult. So you got to have a source of truth, and you've got to govern that source of truth, that it exists and it's consistent. And then how do we signal change? Is it date-based? Is it semantic based upon breaking, non-breaking, patch? So how are we signaling change and why? And can we use both? When do we use each one? So understanding the signals, but then also, more importantly, just having a plan for communication. Are we communicating change and what's happening? Because that's the whole reason why we do version control. It's versioning V1, V2 doesn't matter. It's the fact to remind us to communicate that we're changing things. It's to remind us to communicate, oh, this is breaking or not breaking. So change and communicating is where it's all at. Now, finally, the last piece of API governance is evangelism. Now, I'm not talking just the classic DevRel or Dev advocacy or even my version of API evangelism. This is applicable internal or external. All the building blocks are known. You have content, documentation, blogs, videos, use cases, webinars, but you keep all of that content hands-on, forkable, executable, and part of the work, part of the API. So Open API, collections, Jupyter notebooks, sandboxes. And then you produce that stuff in motion in an ongoing way. Now, a lot of groups create center of excellences, come across a lot of out-of-date GitHub repos, a lot of taken down style guides, a lot of Confluence pages that were created by that last group and they're out of date now. All of this has to be in motion. It has to be just like the rest of your rules and policies. It has to be bite-sized. It has to be meaningful, useful, and it has to be applicable in the moment. So know your audience. Is this internal? Is it external? Where is that audience already existing and engaged there? So if it's Slack, if it's Teams, if it's on Confluence, where are your people who are producing and consuming APIs? Go there and make sure that content is available in an ongoing self-service, but also face-to-face way. So make sure you have office hours, make sure you have regular meetings at the API level, at the governance review level, at the policy level. Bake in regular meetings, regular discussions, ideally face-to-face if possible, but make those real connections and do it in motion, do it in an ongoing way. Don't expect that you're ever going to create one documentation that everyone's going to come and read. They won't. Well, I back off that. There are groups of people who will read it. I apologize. There are groups of people who will show up if you do the work, but do not use that as your only way that you're going to get the word out to people. It's got to be ongoing. It's got to be snackable. It's got to be relevant and contextual because things change. So really, the public service announcement here is avoid distraction. There's a lot of them, especially at the application level. I've seen mobile, web, single page app, bots, AI, several waves of these distractions come along. Different protocols, things that promise are gonna save you. But after 25 years, not a lot has changed. We've gotten some more fancy words and some more fancy tooling and services for talking about governance, talking about management, unbundling, bundling, micro, mono, lots of different discussions. But really, it all comes back to just focus on your HTTP APIs. Get your basic house in order there, your schemas, your APIs, get a governance in motion, get a handle on your operations, have an effective strategy for managing change, and make evangelism just something everybody does. There shouldn't be just one evangelist in your group. Everybody should be an evangelist. And then this is going to help you get your house in order and make sense of things. And that's all I have today. Hopefully it helped, and I appreciate you all sharing up, showing up. And let me see if we have any questions. Got like 5 minutes left for questions, huh,
Yeah,
Buddha?
I was keeping track of a couple of questions. I think interesting enough, there was a conversation around RAML and its relevance. Do you see RAML as still being something that's relevant? Are people moving away from it now, geared a little bit
Um,
towards open API? How do you see that relationship?
Yeah, an important one. So I was, hands up, I was part of the original RAML working group, so I helped kind of bring it there. My honest stance is Open API kind of won those early API specification wars. API Blueprint, Waddle, Swagger, and then RAML. But I'm the first to admit RAML is actually a better spec than Open API, but it didn't win in those early wars. But with that said, it's still in use in a lot of organizations, a lot of enterprises. So it is still very valid. And there's conversion tools that you can use to convert it to Open API. And similarly, you'll come across a lot of SOAP. You'll come across a lot of API Blueprint when you work in orgs. So yes, still relevant.
All right, cool. Um, Nabil asks, can you please share when to apply centralized and when to apply federated governance? First of all, hello, Nabil. There is going to be a dedicated session, by the way, about federated governance and API management a little bit later after lunch. But question to you, Kin, is there a direct way for people to assess what's going to work for them? Is there a degree of maturity that helps them make that decision? How do they choose what's going to work for them?
Yeah, it's gonna first of all, it's gonna vary depending on the enterprise that you're in and how flat it is, how hierarchical it is, what's the history, whether the tribal boundaries, all of that's gonna answer this question. But you should always start with a centralized platform kind of gateway approach, and you're gonna hear a lot of the complaints and criticism and critique about why something should be central, why something should be federated. And then if you have the right feedback loops on not just your APIs, but also the policies in your governance, you can iterate and work towards that because there's some governance that should be centrally available in certain aspects, but some of it should be, much of it should be with the teams themselves. And so it's going to vary on your business, it's going to vary on the politics, but I encourage opening up conversations to make that work.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much. We may have room for maybe one more question. I'm going to pick one that's in the chat right now. Tejaswini asked, hello, Tejaswini as well. Is there any ongoing standardization work happening on non-HTTP APIs as well? Or, is there something that you could shed some light on?
Yeah, I mean, async API follows the same path as Open API. It's a sister specification. It'll do your HTTP as well as your TCP and other protocols. So async API, right alongside that, it uses JSON schema, so that everything I talked about with JSON schema still applies. And then the JSON schema, the spectral rules still apply, the vacuum rules still apply. So everything here still applies. You just use async API to describe the surface area of your APIs. Now, when it comes to gRPC, there's work you can do to standardize across the JSON schema and your protocol buffers. And then similarly with GraphQL, it's got its own realm of schema, but also linting is a kind of a different beast. But you can build your rule set to work with GraphQL. And then I would add in open policy agent when it comes to some of your policies and the gateway and authentication. And so there's a whole mix of specs that are evolving to help you take care of the whole big picture. But what I presented today should help you with that core.
Fantastic. One final question before we head out. I think only have about maybe 45 seconds. And before we go into that, Harish, you've asked me a question about the governance and developer productivity. There's literally a panel discussion that's dedicated to this very topic in about 45 minutes time. So I encourage you to join that. For now, with the limited time, David asks, where can people working on API governance come together on a regular basis outside of Leap? Leap seems to be a good enough place to do that. But where are the communities that people can have these discussions and hopefully learn a little bit more?
Yeah, good question. There's not, I think pretty much each spec you can go work within that community, but there's not a governance wide discussion. So I'm happy to throw up my hand being the kind of vendor neutral third party in this, leading the governance conversation. I do have conversations with people at large enterprises to come together on a Wednesday afternoon or a Thursday and have an hour dedicated. Now, the problem I encounter is people are really holding their cards close to their chest. So we haven't settled in on how we're going to get everyone together in the same space to have these conversations. And that's what's holding things up right now. So feel free. You can find me on API Evangelist and pretty easy to find online. If you have opinions and thoughts, let me know. But we'll pull something together in the next couple of weeks.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And just being the first one after you, I'll be happy to throw my hat in the ring as well to help create that governance community, because A, that's something that I'm excited about. B, it gives me an opportunity to learn. And C, it is a valuable conversation, clearly, given that we are doing an entire conference on it. So really appreciate it, Ken. Um, Thank you so much. And right now, what's going to happen is there's going to be a little bit of break, 4 minutes to the next session. So you can switch around, get a glass of water if necessary. The next session, you'll have two parallel sessions running. There are going to be industry talks, one from Northwestern Mutual, the other one from Zeiss. So feel free to pick and choose which one is your favorite, one in the implementers track, one is your decision makers track, and we'll see you there. Thank you so much, Kane. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for kicking us off in a very positive way.